So when Jean Klein spoke about the traditional approach, which is ignoring all qualifications that come is it this then? Exploring the body or the world without any label or qualification?
Actually, it is beyond my understanding to be able to comment on what the meaning of Jean Klein's teaching, because I actually never understood it myself. So it's beyond understanding. Only somebody like Jean can understand him. But the problem, which was the problem, because with Jean's teaching, is that Jean was taught by Advaita teacher through the Karika of Manukya Upanishad, Karika of Kodapada, but then later on swallowed in by a second teacher, the Kashmir tradition. And of course, as we know, at least people who study the tradition knows, there is an apparent opposition between Shankara and Abhinavagupta, which actually Abhinavagupta accent in the Tantra Loka several times. But this opposition is more scholar point of view, because in India, the way to express a tradition for a teacher has always been to criticize others. And it is not actually because others are false, but to express your point of view, you use other point of view to prove you're right. But that doesn't mean that others are false. It means that to be able to express clearly your point of view, you explain the other point of view are wrong. That's why there is 6 darshana, Nyaya, Visheshika, Samkhya, and so on in India, and the Mimamsa, to which Raphael Torella, the scholar of Kashmir Tantric in Roma, adds Pratyabhin, which is one of the lines of, and the Pratyabhin means Kashmir tradition in general. There is no opposition. Abhinavagupta criticized the Buddhist, Shankara of course too, but then he's used sometimes the Buddha as an expression of truth. Abhinavagupta criticized Patanjali very much, and then he gave him as an example of truth. So it's just a way of speaking. So it is very difficult when you to take a quote from Jean Klein, a sentence to explain it, because Jean sometimes will answer from a Vedantic point of view. I will say to his more gifted students, and to his less gifted student, he will answer generally from a Tantric Kashmiri perspective. But that only him could do that, because Advaita teaching is need to be implemented by somebody who lives this total absence of himself. So only somebody like Ramana Maharshi, Maharaj, Namaima, whatever, and these kind of people are entitled to use the Vedantic perspective, otherwise just words. Kashmir tradition is more democratic because the line of the tradition are much more easy to grab with a mundane mind. To grab the Advaitic perspective, you need a very, an extremely sensitive, deep, and empty mind. So then you're going to study the Karika Kodapada, mostly the Manukya Upanishad, which is a very small text, it's one page. You're going to spend 10 years studying this text, and then, as Jean did, and then this text will unravel his truth, which is what you are. That need a dedicated life, an ascetic life, but it's traditional in India society. The Kashmiri tradition is different. Kashmiri tradition was for laymen as much as for ascetic. So it is a different approach, it is more easy to understand. In Vedantic perspective, you exclude everything. In Tantric perspective, you include everything. Excluding without creating psychological problem need again the presence of a real master. Including is something easier for most people. So when Jean would refer to the traditional way, he could refer to anything. Actually, for him, traditional way was generally meaning looking without accenting the objectivity. Because this you find in both traditions. In the Vedantic perspective, an object is made of 5 principles: Sat, Chit, Ananda, Nama, Rupa. If you remove name and form, Nama, Rupa, what remains is what you are in common with the object: consciousness and beingness, joy, and so on. So Jean will said, look at the roses, take away the name and the shape of the roses. And what remains of the roses is what you are in common, is oneness. Excluding name and form is a Advaitic teaching. Kashmir Tantric, the roses cannot be anything else than consciousness, but is only consciousness. But there's nothing to exclude. Name and form are the celebration of what is beyond name and form. So the traditional way in both cases is the accent of being. This beingness remove naturally the name and form. So what sometimes we will use the expression, as you said, the traditional way is to accept what we are, not what we do. We said at the beginning, yoga is not about what we do, but what we are. There is no doing involved. So when you look at perception, without doing anything mentally, if you do nothing, there's no name and form, because the name of the roses come from your mind, the shape of the roses came from your mind, the smell of the roses come from your mind, all come from your mind. Perception comes from the mind. So if you look with no mind, no mental mind, there is a perceptive mind, of course. But you add nothing. So the rose is purely perception, no conception, no name and form. Then it is the same thing in Kashmir Tantric. For Vinavagupta, the word is the direct expression of consciousness. Vimarsh is the integrating of Prakash, which is the light. As in Advaita, there's always a separation between Prakriti and Purusha. But again, there's no separation. So Jean, when you read Jean, you must read it as poetry, because there's many ways you can understand it, and Jean changes formulation through the time, and what he said in the early 70s was different what he said in the last period of his life. So don't try to really understand when you read Jean. You read it as a poetry. Poetry means nothing. It's a beauty. There may be a reader, but don't understand poetry. It's a kind of sacrilege. So if you read Jean without understanding him, then it may flourish in you in a certain way. But don't try to understand, because of course we cannot understand it. And it is not there to be understood, it is there to be felt. So you read one or few sentences of Jean and you go to sleep with this feeling. Not thinking, feeling. The feeling is like you read a poetry from Rumi or from Rilke or from Tulsidas or whatever. You have a kind of joy, you don't know why. It's not the meaning, it is something else. Then you go to sleep with this feeling. Like you make love with somebody and you person leave and you have a feeling, and you go to sleep with a feeling. So with the text it's the same thing. You must, you read it, you forget it, but you stay with the feeling. Like after a concert, it's always something. Feeling will dissolve in your awareness. That's eventually what Jean Klein defined by the traditional way. To approach something without knowing, simply being open. But there's so much fear in us that it's difficult for us being open. Maybe this, maybe that. Yes, no, positive, negative. Is it good for me, is it bad for me? It's very strong in us. And that's to be welcome, because that's what we are like. We are like that. So we must live with fact, with reality. So that's why spirituality is in a way a waste of time, because it takes you away from yourself. It's really important how you function. When you're jealous, when you suffer, when you're bitter, when you regret, when you said, I should not have done that, that should be better, I should do that. This is all this fantasy I must discover, deeply rooted in myself. There is the real teaching. The meaning is to see oneself, what we call oneself.